Hello, I'm Mark Johnson from specialist public services law firm TPPlaw. This presentation is about the new method of procuring infrastructure known as PF2, the successor to PFI, the Private Finance Initiative. The announcement of PF2 follows a 2-year review into the previous PFI, which began in 2011 when the Chancellor announced that he was creating a new model for delivering public assets and services. The objective of that review was to create a model which was cheaper, accesses a wider range of private sector financing sources, and strikes a better balance of risk between the private and the public sectors. It's fair to say that during that period, PFI had become a bit of a political football, and that, coupled with the impact of the banking crisis, had a big impact on the pipeline of projects coming through under PFI, not least because the number of funders willing to participate in the market had declined and the margins that funders wanted to charge had increased very significantly, impacting therefore on the value for money case of using PFI as a procurement method. So PF2 promises us a new, faster and more transparent approach to securing investment in public infrastructure. Let's examine some of the detail of this, and I think to understand the context of this, we need first of all to go back in time to November 1992. Well, what was happening at that time? Well, if you recall, this was the annus horribilis for the Queen when Windsor Castle went up in flames, destroying many priceless treasures. And also this lady was in the charts for 10 weeks with the theme from The Bodyguard. Most important for our purposes was that the then Chancellor, Norman Lamont, announced a new plan that all capital projects would henceforth have to test the use of private finance to bring forward investment. Now this led to a rather ludicrous situation. Those of us who can recall what that meant in practice at the time will remember that, for example, the Further Education Funding Council published a brochure setting out a pipeline of capital projects that might be suitable for private financing, and I can remember vividly seeing one in there which was for the Barnsley College toilet block extension, valued at just £250,000. Plainly that was completely unsuited to a project financing method. At that time, the landscape for PFI deals was rather a wild west. There were no clear ground rules or standardised documents, although those began to emerge as the Treasury developed the standardisation of PFI contracts guidance, which is now into its 5th iteration. You will also recall that at that time PFI was the only game in town, in the sense that if you wanted access to capital from the Treasury, that had to be in the form of revenue support grant, or what was known as PFI credits, in order to access the funds. So effectively, if you wanted to embark on a procurement, your only choice was to go down the PFI route. Thinking about the benefits of PFI then, as they were set out at the time, first of all, PFI was thought to encourage an efficient allocation of risks to those best able to manage them, and that was particularly the case because in any project finance structure, the revenue stream to the contractor would only start to flow once the facility had actually been completed, and therefore he had a built-in incentive to build the facility to time and budget and to get it open so that the revenue could start to flow. The second feature was that banks would pay particular attention to the project's economics and carry out a very thorough due diligence at the outset to make sure that the predicted costs in the financial model were in fact viable and a true reflection of both the building costs and also the whole life operating costs during the life of the project. So they would spend considerable time and resource in carrying out an audit of those costs at the outset, which would give a very clear picture of the life cycle costs for the project going forward. Another supposed benefit, which is perhaps slightly more debatable, was that PFI would use output specifications rather than detailed input specifications, and this was thought to encourage more innovation and good ideas from private sector contractors. In practice, however, there were some slightly odd situations. I can remember with some of the early hospital PFIs, for example, there was a particular problem with corridors not being wide enough to accommodate hospital beds because those had not been specified with sufficient precision at the outset. So perhaps a slightly more debatable point there in terms of the benefits. And of course another clear advantage is that the payment stream to the service provider is linked to the satisfaction of performance standards. That could be the availability of the premises or the delivery of certain support services in accordance with the standards set out in the contract. If the services or the facilities were not available or performed to the required standard, then the contractor suffers payment deductions accordingly. Thinking about the disadvantages of PFI, the things that detractors often raise, well, first of all, there is inherently higher cost of finance in providing infrastructure using this method, and of course that has been higher still since the credit crisis. Perhaps it discourages a challenging approach to value for money in the way that the project is scoped, because the payments are obviously deferred over a 25 to 30 year period. There has been criticism of the flexibility of contracts in that public authorities are obviously locked into a long-term period for payback of the capital and interest, and there are very high costs of terminating the structure if something goes wrong. Criticism too about whether risk has effectively been transferred. Public authorities are obviously under various public sector duties, statutory duties, and therefore they will have to step in as a last resort and provide services regardless of what is happening with the contract. Fast forward then to 2013, and we now have a situation of a very significant pipeline of deals that have been signed, over 700, and that represents something like £75 billion worth of investment that's gone down the PFI route. PFI has been used quite successfully across a wide range of public sector infrastructure, from the early transportation deals to hospitals, and then later local government facilities, particularly schools, waste and social care, for example. When the review into PFI began in 2011, there were some particular areas of concern that the Treasury decided to focus upon. The first being the perception from both public and private side, really, that the procurement process was too slow and expensive. Secondly, that contracts were very inflexible. There were the sort of notorious cases of where small works were to be carried out, such as changing a light bulb or putting up a shelf, and the cost of doing that through a PFI contract was prohibitively high because of the different layers of management costs that would be added in to cater for a variation like that. Particular criticism was levelled at the lack of transparency in these contracts, particularly for the public purse. Money was seen to be flowing out of projects in unexpected ways, often resulting in windfall gains, particularly, for example, where contractors were refinancing the debt element of projects or perhaps selling on their shareholdings in the project, or in some cases draining money out of the life cycle fund in a way that was unexpected. Let's just remind ourselves about the typical structure for a PFI project shown in this diagram. At the top we have the public sector client entering into a project agreement with a special purpose vehicle company, SPV, which has been set up by the project sponsors specifically to develop this project, and it's that company that acts as the receptacle, if you like, for all of the contractual rights and revenue streams which the project is going to generate. Underneath the special purpose vehicle company there will be a supply chain which typically consists of a building contractor on the left hand side, and on the right hand side an operating company or facilities manager who is entrusted with managing that infrastructure within defined cost parameters over the life of the project. Out to the right sits the senior lender, typically providing up to 90% of the capital cost of the project, and senior lender is extremely risk averse. He will be looking to push as much risk as possible onto the various supply chain subcontractors sitting at the bottom there, so one can expect that the contracts that those people enter into will be very tightly defined and will seek to push a very large degree of risk onto those companies. Out to the left are the equity investors. Now, in some cases that might be companies that are within the same group as the building contractor or the facilities manager. In some cases not, though. There is a buoyant industry of third-party investors in infrastructure projects, and the expectation is that they will be taking a higher degree of risk than the senior lenders in order to develop the project. So it can be seen that these SPV structures are financed using a very high level of debt. They're very highly leveraged, and with a relatively small amount of shareholder equity being used to finance the project company. And although debt is cheaper than equity, that has led to some criticism that the equity component and therefore the real risk taking has been relatively small. And as we'll see in a moment, that is something that the new PF2 model seeks to address. Turning then to look at some of the features of the new PF2 model, some of the headline points to note. First of all, in future, the equity component of the investment will include a tranche which is put in by the public sector, and in most cases that will be somewhere between 30 to 49% of the total equity contribution. And the thinking is that that contribution will encourage much better partnership working and transparency over the affairs of the SPV, because the public sector will have a seat at the table, will have access to management accounts and all of the financial affairs of the SPV. In future, there will be fewer opportunities for windfall gains because the public sector is holding an equity stake and will be entitled to participate in those gains, and also through some tightening up of the standardised contracts, for example around distributions from the life cycle maintenance fund. In future, any surpluses that are distributed from that will be shared 50-50 between the contractor and the public sector client. The next feature then is increasing the amount of the equity contribution from somewhere around 10% to 25%. So that has a very different investment profile from the 90-10 split. And reading between the lines, I think this is intended to attract different types of senior debt funders into the market for infrastructure projects, because that higher equity contribution means that, for example, it will be possible for a project to achieve a higher investment grade rating from the ratings agencies, which might open up the possibility of using capital markets transactions or institutional investors who perhaps would have been more risk averse, to a more highly geared structure. We're told that the public sector equity contribution is going to be held by a centralised body. It may be Infrastructure UK, or it may be somebody else. That's not yet been finally determined. But it's important to note that by contrast with something like a local education partnership or a LIFT scheme, the immediate public sector client, the local authority or the NHS body, doesn't seem to be the shareholder here. It's actually a centralised body that will hold those stakes. The public sector equity contribution could be somewhere between 30 to 49% of the total equity component, and there's also the opportunity to bring in some third-party equity just before financial close by running a funding competition. So this is equity which is not necessarily coming from the building contractor or other project sponsors. This is third-party investors coming in at a late stage. Now, although in practice that appears to be a good idea, I can foresee that there are going to be some interesting difficulties with that. For example, will the returns available to somebody coming in at the 11th hour be the same as those earned by those who've been in the project all through the development phase and arguably have taken more risk? I think also it will add some extra complexity to the documentation to have different classes of investor, some of whom we will not know the identity of until the very last minute. So taking all of this together, the theory is that this will improve value for money for the public purse. There will be greater transparency and accountability by the public sector being a shareholder in the SPV. The theory goes that when the public sector holds an equity stake, it will have to start thinking differently. It will have to really understand the risks in the project and seek to minimise them. And it will have to adopt more of a collaborative approach to improving project performance. We can see the impact of this illustrated in this diagram. You see now out to the right the senior debt providers are providing a 75% contribution to the capital costs, and perhaps a much wider range of investors, which could include capital markets, bondholders, and there has been talk, for example, of including the European Investment Bank as a potential funder. Over to the left, the equity investors now made up of a wider collection of contributors. Public sector equity, somewhere between 30 to 49% of the total equity component. And then underneath that, the industry sponsors, i.e. the collaborators that have come together to develop this project, and alongside them some third-party investors who may be invited in at the last moment. Turning then to look at some other features of PF2, we find in some of the detail of the documentation that in future procurements are going to be run on a centralised basis and probably only used for projects with a capital value in excess of £50 million. I suppose that doesn't necessarily bar projects where you batch up smaller projects into one programme, which in total could total £50 million. In future, we're going to be looking at an accelerated procurement process. The new rules will say that if the project is not signed within 18 months of commencing procurement, then the funding can be withdrawn by the Treasury unless special permission has been obtained from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury to proceed beyond that date. I think in practice that's going to raise some interesting issues. If the deadline is approaching, that will put the authority under some pressure in the negotiations and may force them to make concessions in order to bring the project in by the deadline. In future, we're going to have a much more transparent pipeline of projects. All of the projects that are going to be developed through PF2 will be advertised on a central government website. And we will also see some more standardised documents. At the moment, the standardisation process is really focused on the project agreement and the lender's direct agreement. in future we're going to see some other standardised documents for use in the project, including a shareholders agreement, the use of which will be mandatory. And it's also interesting to note that the guidance around standardisation, although the previous version ran into 325 pages, we now have 400 pages to wade through. Turning then to look at some of the alterations to the risk profile under the PF2 model, probably the first thing to note, the most important thing, is that in future soft services such as cleaning, catering, ICT will not generally be included in the scope of the project. There may be some exceptions to this where there is a clear case for integrating these with other services that are being provided, and the example given in the guidance there is in prisons and defence projects. One implication of taking out the soft services might be that the market appetite of some of the facilities management companies might decline, given that they don't necessarily stand to gain lucrative contracts for the soft services element, although of course they will still be responsible for hard facilities management, building maintenance and life cycle issues throughout the project's life. Secondly then, we've got some changes around utilities risk. In the past there have been various attempts to pass on the risk of utility tariffs and consumptions to private sector partners. In future, generally the rule will be that utilities risk is now a public sector risk, and that is thought to offer a better value for money. However, there will still be some opportunities in the design specification to require a facility or a building to comply with certain environmental standards. There are also changes around site conditions risk. In some projects this has been a particularly difficult area of negotiations. I can think of some projects where asbestos risk has been a particular concern. In future, the general rule will be that these risks rest with the public sector and will not be transferred. And another area of change is the allocation of risk associated with insurance costs, particularly premium increases during the life of the project. Again, it's thought that attempting to pass this risk over to the private sector has not offered value for money, and therefore in future there is much greater flexibility for public sector to absorb this risk, or even in some cases to self-insure where that offers the best value for money. Turning then to look at the pipeline of projects that will proceed under PF2, and I'm afraid the position is rather uncertain at the moment. We know that certain elements of PF2 have been touted for inclusion in some hospital procurements that are already underway in Liverpool and Sandwell. It was thought that PF2 would be used for a large component of the Priority Schools building programme. Out of the 261 schools that have been given preliminary approval to proceed under PSBP, 42 have been earmarked to proceed using a conventional design and build contract, and the rest were supposed to proceed under PF2. However, recent government announcements have cast some doubt on the readiness of PF2 to proceed for that privately financed element of the school building programme. Some press reports are saying that the government is in discussions with capital bond markets and the European Investment Bank to see whether they would come in as potential investors. All of this is obviously going to take some time and has caused some delay to the programme. It was also thought that the Ministry of Defence was ready to use PF2 for two high-profile defence accommodation projects, although they appear to have rowed back from that position and instead moved those into a conventional funding model. So, all in all, it seems that the pipeline for PF2 projects is quite uncertain at this stage, which is obviously quite unsatisfactory for the industry in preparing for the use of this new model. So what conclusions can we draw from all this then? Well, first of all, I think it's self-evident that a higher equity contribution into the project structure implies a higher cost of finance, and perhaps also the extra complexity involved in the contracts and the structure of the project could result in higher transaction costs to set up the model in the first place. Secondly, the question is what appetite there will be from funders. Some commentators have said that changing the structure from a typical 10% equity component to a 25% equity component is in part a bit of a warning shot over the bows of current lenders in the market, attempting to bring in perhaps more competition from a wider class of potential senior debt providers. The second issue is whether removal of some of the current incentives and profit-sharing mechanisms will deter some investors from coming into the markets, and indeed the removal of soft services from the scope of projects may mean that a whole class of industry players may no longer be interested in bidding for some of these projects. Third observation is that the current pipeline of projects appears to be very sparse. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly from local authorities' perspective, is that this move towards centralised procurement, either by teams sitting within the Treasury or indeed the Department of Health or the Ministry of Defence, implies a shift of power from local procurement and accountability to a much more centralised model, which will have significant implications, I think, for perhaps the relationship between the end user of facilities and the provider of the infrastructure. That concludes this short briefing on PF2, the new procurement method for infrastructure using private finance. If you'd like further information, please get in touch with us. Thank you for listening.
TPPlaw, the public services specialists. Connect with us on tpplaw.co.uk or join the debate online in our LinkedIn forum. Search groups for Public Service Partnerships Forum.